Good evening and welcome to the third evening in our Spotlight Lecture Series, sponsored by Children's Dental Center of Madison. We created this series to give friends of St. Ambrose Academy a window into the classroom, get to know the faculty, and see the kinds of experiences our students have through our Catholic classical curriculum. I encourage you to check out ambroseacademy.org/spotlight for next semester's lineup. Please remember that there will be some time at the end of the lecture for those who want to stick around and ask me any questions, so please type those into the comments section on the Facebook page at any point, and we'll come back to them at the end. Tonight, I'm going to be presenting on a topic that typically fascinates students as well as adults, the world of the Vikings. My name is Dr. Geoffrey Ludvik. I am a history teacher at St. Ambrose Academy, and in my spare time, I am an actual archaeologist. I have my PhD in the subject from UW-Madison, and I work as a researcher. I might not focus on the Vikings, but I certainly do enjoy them, like I hope most of you do. Tonight is going to be a little bit different if you have tuned in for any of the other of our lecture series. This is going to be essentially an attempt to simulate a live class that students at St. Ambrose would be able to participate in. Yes, that means I'm going to be asking you, the audience, questions. Please type responses to these questions into the Facebook comments section. I'll be able to see them, try to respond to them. What this is going to essentially be simulating is a Socratic discussion. This is one of the hallmarks of a St. Ambrose education, and hopefully you'll be able to get at least a taste of that in this discussion of the Vikings tonight. If you are a St. Ambrose parent tuning in, especially a parent of a 9th or 10th grade student, your students actually saw half of this presentation yesterday, and we'll see the second half of it tomorrow. Well, some of the details have been shifted for the format change of this. It is essentially the same lesson that I'm teaching the students. So let's get started. I begin each of my classes with a question of the day. And so I'm going to pose to you a question of the evening. Who were the Vikings? It really is a testament to the ferocity and infamy and actually undisputable accomplishments of the Vikings that this term itself is still just as evocative 13 centuries after the Vikings rampaged their way onto the world stage. From Halloween costumes to the NFL, from documentaries to TV dramas, Vikings are alive and well in the 21st century, especially in my home state of Minnesota. Don't worry, I am a Packers fan. Many identify the Vikings generally with the Scandinavian culture. Technically speaking, Viking is not a single ethnic group, but rather it's a profession that certain individuals in ancient Norway, Sweden, and Denmark engaged in. It translates to something like raider, or perhaps better, pirate. Between the 8th and 11th centuries AD, these seaborne marauders struck terror into the hearts of Christian Europe and sailed well past the borders of the known world. But what was life actually like for the Vikings, and why do they still captivate our imaginations today? Tonight, I'd like to focus on what the things the Vikings left behind can tell us about their culture. What are their artifacts speaking about? I'm an archaeologist, so I really dig reading artifacts as history. Right? My classes are typically full of awful, awful jokes. So there was the one for the evening. No promises, I probably will make more. But specifically, I'd like to present 5 brief case studies, right? Particularly from archaeological sites in the Scandinavian world. First, I'd like to take a look at a few images to sort of orient you to basic Viking culture, and from there we'll dive into these case studies. Most of these are actual Viking artifacts. I'd like you to take a look at the images on this slide for a moment, please. If you have access to your keyboard, now's where the audience participation is going to be key. What are these artifacts? What was their purpose? And what can they tell us about Viking culture? Take a moment, think about that. What are these artifacts? At least the one on the left is actually an artifact. It's in the National Archaeology Museum in Denmark. The other is a replica. Yeah, I mean, these are the sorts of questions that I will typically ask students as we begin. What are these artifacts? Right? What were their uses? Right? So you can see one of them, they're all made of metal. Right? That tells you something about their culture. Right? One of them looks pretty sharp. Right? One of them looks pretty solid and sturdy. Right? Some of them look like it's been really intricately woven together, right? But it's made out of metal. What do you make of this? I would call on people, but alas, you're not in the room. Hopefully it's not that hard of a question. Right, well, if this isn't getting you, let's try the next image. Right? This is related. What is this? What does that tell us about Viking culture? And what is on that thing? It's made of iron, I can tell you that. Right? It's an actual artifact. That's pretty cool. What was this used for? I mean, thinking about an entire culture as evocative as the Vikings, these items are telling us a part of their story, each of them. Right? And they might be gathering dust in museum collections, but they're telling us something. So someone has said it's a sword. Excellent observation, right? I mean, that is typologically what this artifact is. It's a sword, right? And what do Vikings do with swords? Have them on walls. Someone said warrior culture. Excellent. Right? So the previous slide had an axe, some chainmail, a helmet. Right? We have a sword. This is a warrior culture. Perhaps no other culture in Northern Europe is more evocative of warrior culture than Vikings. Very good. Is it ceremonial? Excellent question, right? There's something on this sword that might not seem to be like on every sword, right? There's writing. So the cool thing about this particular weapon, anyone run in particular shoes? Right? Dr. Ludvik likes running in his free time. Some of the students have occasionally seen me doing this. Right? Those are runes on the sword. Right? So runic writing is a system that is developed to record Scandinavian language, Germanic languages. This is essentially the same sort of mark that Dr. Ludvik has on his running shoes. Right? This is like saying Nike or Adidas, except on a sword. Right? And this particular sword was made by a blacksmithing firm, and it was the Vikings' favored weapon. It's imported from Germanic craftsmen working with the Franks. Let's take a look at the next slide. Similar ideas. What does this tell us? Right? What does this tell us about Viking culture? Right, so we've had an axe, we've had a helmet, we've had chainmail, we've had a sword. Right? A sword uses a lot more metal than an axe. Right? So probably not every person could afford a sword. Movies might do that, but that's not the actual fact of the matter. Right? Most people would probably have an axe. So we certainly have this idea of a warrior culture. But what else are they doing? There's more to the Vikings than meets the eye. If they were just mindless marauders, they probably would have been. Right, so what else are they doing? So we got a bunch of different pieces of metal. If anyone's a lawyer out there or ever seen a court, you might have some idea what that thing is over there on the left. Right, and then on the right, there's a good old pile of something. It looks shiny. Awful lot of them. Interestingly enough, a third of these shiny things originated in the Islamic Caliphate. They're from the Middle East. Right? These are found in Denmark. Right? Scales for commerce is 110% correct. Right? The Vikings, in addition to being fearsome warriors, were equally fearsome merchants. Right? They're going around not only attacking people, but also trading with them. And so that is a portable set of scales that was found in ancient Denmark. Right? And that big hoard of silver would be the prime currency for the Vikings, including a very lively trade with the Arabic states, as well as with Christian Europe and all over the world. Next slide, please. What about this? What does this tell us about the Vikings? Hopefully it's fairly obvious. It's in a nice, big, well-lit museum. It's in Norway, I can tell you that. It appears to be made of wood. Very, very finely made out of wood. How does this relate to who the Vikings are? Thinking of my home state of Minnesota, which recently rebuilt a certain football stadium, meant to evoke one of these. Right? Anyone have a stab at what these are called? Very distinctive of the Viking culture. How do they get from point A to point B? Scandinavia, where Vikings are from, right, is north of mainland Europe. Right? It is well away from hearts of civilization like France, like Italy, like the Mediterranean. How are the Vikings going to get there? Right? Well, clearly, they get there by boat. Right? That's what this is. This is a Viking longship. Right? And if you can move to the next slide, please. This is actually a very important archaeological find. This is one of the most significant finds ever to come out of Norway. It's called the Osenberg's ship. It was the final resting place for two spectacularly wealthy Viking women, actually. It's far more flashy than a functional warship that the Vikings would have used, but it actually illustrates much about Viking culture. Okay, so this has given us a brief overview of elements of Viking culture. What I'd like to do from here on out, right, there's one, before I dive into that, there's a question, why had such a flat hull? That's a very astute observation. One of the things that makes Viking ships so fearsome is their ability to transition from seafaring to river faring. And this sort of adds to the fearsome reputation of Vikings, because not only can their ships land traders, merchants, and warriors on the coasts of a country, they could sail deep up rivers in order to launch their cargoes there. Great. So I'm going to recap briefly. Artifacts that we've looked at are showing that Vikings are skilled warriors, right? But they're also skilled seafarers. They're traders. They're merchants. They're craftsmen. If you looked at those swords, those axes, the chainmail, it takes a lot of effort to make something like that. Clearly, not everyone in this society is a bloodthirsty maniac going off and looting. Right? There needs to be some level of civilization present in order to produce artifacts like that. You need farmers, you need some people supporting these warriors. Right? We also see how they cared for their dead. Right? Building a giant ship and burying two elite women on it speaks a lot to the power that certain Vikings wielded over others in their culture. So I'd like to look more particularly at a series of 5 archaeological sites very briefly. The first site I'd like to investigate is Salme. Salme is on an island off the coast of Estonia. In all honesty, the name of the island is utterly unpronounceable to me, and so I'm going to just call it by the name of the site, Salme. So take a look at the aerial photograph that's about to appear. Okay, this is an aerial photograph of the archaeological site of Salme. What do you see? Okay, so this is taken from the air, either a drone or actually a plane. So as an archaeologist, I look at stains like this in the ground all the time, and it is my job to figure out what does it mean. Right? So take a look at the shape. What is this? Right? This is the remains of something. You can see from my notes there's a little bit of giveaway of what's happening here. Right? Whatever it is, it's 38 feet long, and inside of it, there are 33 adult men. Right? What could this be? Anyone want to volunteer an answer? It's a boat. Yeah, very good. It's a boat. Right? It's a ship burial. This is one of the things that really defines Viking culture. Right? They're warriors. They're going abroad. Estonia is in the far eastern Baltic. Right? Viking homeland is Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, the western Baltic. Right? So these individuals are far from home, but clearly from their artifacts, they are in fact Vikings. Right? These warriors, right, and you can tell they're warriors, were buried quickly, but with surprisingly rich grave goods. Right? So if you see that was the outline of a ship, there were 33 men buried in one part of the ship. Right? The ship was dragged to land, the men were put on the ship, they were buried rapidly, and they were stacked one on top of each other. Right? And with them were found not only swords, right, but also gaming pieces, right? Like pieces to a game. Right? Why would you have so many objects for entertainment on a warship? Right? This is kind of odd, right? how would this happen? Why would you have a bunch of stuff to do? Right? So there's 33 adult men in the prime of their life. You can study their bones, you can study a lot about them, and what's been found from this is they're in the prime of life. But many of them suffered trauma, right? Lethal trauma from sharp and blunt objects. Right? So it's clear they are killed in battle. Right? So they have gaming tokens, they have swords. Clearly these guys are not just run-of-the-mill peasants. Right? To have swords with gold and silver inlay, these guys are pretty rich, and all of them had swords. All 33 of these men are found with these really elite-type weapons, right? And a lot of entertainment pieces. And so there is actually a theory among current archaeologists that these guys were actually not just your run-of-the-mill Viking war bands. These were, in fact, diplomats who were killed in the course of their attempts at diplomacy. Whether or not this is true, we'll have to see. There's a comment, a question. Was there room for a hold under the main deck? Viking ships are typically going to be rowed, so they wouldn't have large holds. They would have small holds underneath the main deck. It's a very good question. Right? So to look at this, right, the greater portion of a Viking warband, right, is interred on this ship. Right? So you can kind of think about this. If this is the majority of a Viking warband, where's everybody else? How did the battle go? Well, they probably lost. Right? So this battle in Estonia between what may have been a diplomatic convoy is clearly lost. And one of the very important things about this site is its very early dating. Right? These war bands are typical of shipborne battle groups among the Vikings, right? But this site dates from 700 to 750 AD, the very dawn of the Viking Age, right? As these individuals are starting to sail out into different locations. Another site that illuminates the treatment of the glorious dead in Viking culture was only very recently uncovered. It's the site of Jell Mound in Norway. It's actually currently being excavated by archaeologists right now. And a press release came out as recently as November 11th of this year. Looking at the site of Jell Mounds, you can see special images taken by archaeologists using ground-penetrating radar. They use this to see underneath the ground before putting a shovel or a pickaxe in, so that you're not going in blind. What do you see? So you're looking at a top plan of radar imagery. Take a minute, just look at this. There's circular. There's a lot of them in this area. Right? And one of them on the lower left has something that looks like a piece of a very popular board game from when I was a kid. Two people would play it. You sunk my... Right? These are burial mounds. Right? And they date to AD 500. And a solid 250 years before the beginning of the Viking Age. But what's especially significant is what is inside one of these mounds. Right? This is a zoom in of the same image. This is another ship. Right? This is another Viking ship burial. It's a longship, and a longboat, the final resting place for a highly wealthy and important individual. The vessel is 60 feet long. Right? It was buried around AD 800. It's inserted into a previously existing burial mound. Nearby, there are actually the buried remains of a Viking feasting hall, right, on this site. Clearly, this is a cemetery for very important, very wealthy individuals. Right? How many people do you think could afford to be buried in something like this? A 60-foot-long ship that probably could earn a lot of money abroad. Probably not very many people. Right? Jell Mound shows us what rituals surrounded the death and burial of the highest status Vikings, and proves to us that there was a social hierarchy among them, with some very clear haves, and probably a lot more very clear have-nots in service to those kings and queens of the Viking world. Let's move from the Viking homeland to the British Isles. The next site I'd like to look at is called Lindisfarne. It's called the Holy Island, located off the coast of what was once called Northumbria, essentially northern England. What does this site look like to you? Well, astute viewers may have noticed that on the last slide, I actually called it Lindisfarne Monastery. Right? So this is, in fact, a Christian monastery. In AD 793, this was a fully functional monastic community off the coast of England. England is in a monastic renaissance. There's culture, art, learning. Right? Who lives in a monastery? Well, monks. Monks live in monasteries. right? What do monks typically do in a monastery? Well, they pray and they work, right? Ora et labora, the two pillars of the Benedictine rule, right? Ora et labora. That's what these monks are doing. And what sort of labora do these guys do? The Gospels, right? They're illuminating manuscripts, making beautiful pieces of art, and preserving literature and culture for Western civilization. Right? These monks are scholars. Right? So a question here is, are these monks Knights Templar? No, very clearly not, right? The Knights Templar didn't exist for another 300 years, right? That order of warrior monks, pretty different from the scholar monks who would have lived at Lindisfarne. No, these men didn't have any defenses. Right? Look around. What do they have going on this monastery? Other than water, not a whole lot of anything. Right? The nearest garrison of soldiers was located far away. The monks were seeking isolation to pursue God and work. They came here for seclusion and meditation and study. Out of love for God, the wealthiest Anglo-Saxons in England at the time would donate gold and silver and precious items for use in the Mass at Lindisfarne, as well as gold and other items for leaf illumination in manuscripts. So that means these monks had a lot of wealth hoarded here. Right? They're far from warriors. They're isolated from anyone who could protect them. And they are custodians of a literal gold mine. Anyone see where I'm going with this? For Lindisfarne. Poor Lindisfarne. Right? Yeah. Lindisfarne is one of the most famous sites of a Viking attack. Right? In 793, the first recorded Viking invasion of a European monastery takes place. This grave marker found from the site is commemorating the attack. Right? So the monks of Lindisfarne are attacked. These are Viking raiders depicted on a stone found at the monastery. Right? This is an unthinkable tragedy. Right? Like hungry wolves from the sea, a Viking warband makes landfall on this island, slaughters the defenseless monks, loots the monastery, and then disappears. They were absolutely sitting ducks, right? And these men of God were put to the sword. Right? The Christians of Western Europe were absolutely horrified by this atrocity. What's worse, it's only the first of many raids on Christian lands. The Vikings were such ferocious warriors, no Christian army that was deployed against them could hold them back, and nowhere in Christendom was safe. Viking longboats, as we pointed out, with their flat bottoms, could just as easily maneuver in rivers as they could on sea. And cities as important as Paris itself is besieged by Viking riverboats in the course of the Viking Age. Right? Eventually, whole armies attack Europe. So contemporary texts describe the raid on Lindisfarne as unexpected, extremely violent, and provoking intense fear among their Christian prey. Right? The fury of the Northmen, right, is something that is emphasized in some of these quotes that you're looking at from primary sources from the period. Right? Alcuin, who is a scholar in the court of Charlemagne, even compares the Viking raids to a wrathful judgment of God as depicted in the book of Jeremiah. Right? Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. Right? Deliver us, God, from the savage race of Northmen which lays waste our realms. Right? It was an actual prayer used in churches during this time period. Next slide, please. At the time, were there others in the area aware of the risk of Vikings? Very good question. Yes. People were very clearly aware of the Vikings being a threat. No one thought they'd actually come out and kill monks. Right? Vikings were doing their thing, being Vikings, long before the beginning of this age. Even in the Roman period, you have tribes from Scandinavia using boats to attack the Roman province of Gaul and Britain. Right? The problem comes when the Vikings are forgotten about. And people don't really continue to pay attention to Northern Europe because, well, Rome has fallen and everyone is trying to put the pieces back together, not focusing on what's happening to their north. Right? And the Vikings take advantage of this situation and they attack. Very interestingly, typically Vikings would not attack a target they did not first scout out. Right? They could be attacking people that only a week earlier they had come to trade with. I'll give you some of this amber if you give me those 10 goats. Okay, guys, let's get them. They have no defenses, right? That's the sort of thing that we're talking about with these guys, right? there's a lot of contemporary texts on this subject. For the purposes of time, I will leave you to investigate the Anglo-Saxon chronicles on your own. So if we can move to the next slide, please. Right. From contemporary texts, it's not without reason that monks as well as kings were afraid of the Vikings. The site of Torksey in England testifies to one of the darkest episodes for the Anglo-Saxons in this kingdom, a decade-long invasion of all kingdoms in the British Isles by massive Viking armies. Right. Arriving in AD 865, a grand army of heathens, as it was called, invaded England. Right. And why were they invading England? Land. Right. Not content with just taking gold and stuff from monasteries, Vikings actually saw the weakness of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, their disunity, and invaded with the intent to settle, to take land. Right? Invading this territory, seizing it by conquest or diplomacy, Vikings sought to settle down. And this is another side of Viking culture that you see. They're not only about these raids, they're actually trying to find more land. It's probably why many Viking warriors, pirates, turned to this sort of lifestyle. Right? There wasn't enough land for their overpopulated areas of Scandinavia, and so they send them out to try to find and colonize more and more distant places. Right? Before turning to plowshares, however, the Vikings certainly turned to the sword. By AD 880, only one kingdom still stood in England free of Viking control. That was the kingdom of Wessex, under the great command of King Albert the Great. Ultimately, he's the man who unites the Anglo-Saxons to effectively fight off the Vikings, preserving his own kingdom. Right? But the rest of England isn't quite as lucky. The site of Torksey was a winter camp used by the Viking army. And we can see from the artifacts found there that the Vikings were here, in central England, right, ready for battle. Right? For the Vikings, right, being in England, this meant that their roving bands of warriors had won a land to call their own. Right? They settled down, and very rapidly the invaders assimilated into local cultures. Right? And so you get this Viking culture melding with English culture. Well, the sites we focused on so far emphasize the warlike culture of raiding and looting and killing that defined Viking life. There's far more to the Vikings than this. Right? Vikings are also known for their voyages of exploration and colonization in the far reaches of the known world. Take a look at this site, Landsauk's Meadows. What do you think this used to be? Study the picture, take a look at it. Right? Around the year 1000 or 1020, a group of Vikings put ashore on this distant Arctic island. Right? These are the remains of a turf booth, or a hut, set up for these Viking men to survive a harsh Arctic winter on this island. Here's a modern reconstruction of what this is. Right? This is actually much nicer than the original huts would have been, but you can see about 90 individuals are said to have lived here by archaeologists studying it. It's a small settlement, but it had a smithy for blacksmithing. They had facilities to hunt for and process bog iron, a natural resource on the island, and a lot of areas for ship repair. Artifacts at Landsauk's Meadows include iron nails, distinctive Viking cloak pins made of copper, and various small finds testifying to Viking lifestyles, not appreciably different from those in their homeland of Scandinavia. Well, why am I bringing up such a small and seemingly insignificant site? There's not all that much that I showed you about this. Well, let me tell you, Landsauk's Meadows is astounding. Not for any individual Viking-related find. Those are obvious. No, its monumental significance to world history comes from its location. Right? Landsauk's Meadows is the first European settlement in North America, right? Located on the coast of modern-day Newfoundland, Canada. Right? Vikings settled lands where no Europeans had ever yet set foot, beginning in Iceland, moving to colonies in Greenland under Eric the Red, and Viking sagas then, by Leif Erikson, or Leif the Lucky, continue naming these different territories, Hilluland, Markland, and Vinland. It's here, at Landsauk's Meadows, that Viking explorer Leif Erikson, or Leif the Lucky, made landfall and set up a small settlement. On Greenland, the Vikings were not alone. On Landsauk's Meadows, the Vikings were not alone. The Skrælings, as the sagas called them, were described as expert hunters and fierce warriors, so much so that they drove the Vikings from the colony at Landsauk's Meadows on Vinland and warred with the Greenland colonies. Who were the Skrælings? history knows them as the Inuit. Take a look at this figurine. It's simple, carved from Arctic driftwood. It's found on the floor of an Inuit home from around the year 1250 to 1300 on Baffin Island, right, a very northerly island just west of Greenland. What do you notice about this figure? What do you make of the clothes? Does this figure look like an Inuit? Right? Note that sort of skirt going on. Particularly pay attention to the chest. Is there anything on the chest that you can see? Is there a symbol, something incised there? What is this? This individual does not look like an Inuit, though it's found in an Inuit house. Right? And there's a symbol carved on the chest of this person, this driftwood artifact. Now, this isn't some conspiracy theory website, though there were plenty of those out there when I was doing research on this. This is from the Canadian Museum of History. Right? This figurine depicts a Norse Viking, right, made by an Inuit craftsman in 1250 to 1300 AD. It is the oldest known depiction of a European made by a Native American. What's more, this Viking, if you can see it, it might be difficult to see in the picture, this Viking has a cross carved onto his chest by the Inuit craftsman. Right? He's a Christian. The Vikings at Langsauks Meadows would have been a mix of pagans and Christians. Right? Christian evangelization among the Vikings was a slow process, still incomplete by AD 1000. Right? Eventually, the Christians did convert their kinsmen, even in the distant colony of Greenland. Right? Greenland eventually became home of its own bishop, right? With the last recorded wedding taking place on Greenland in AD 1408. Right? When the colonies were abandoned due to deteriorating climatic conditions that made life untenable in those areas. Viking exploration of North America ceased sometime before that point, as expeditions were becoming too expensive and the colonies struggled to survive. It seems that Vinland was not explored much further, despite being briefly reoccupied by Leif's brother, who was himself a devout Christian. The story of Langsauks Meadows and this Baffin figurine remains. 400 years before Columbus, it was the Vikings who made first contact with Native America. And in the ensuing conflict, according to the Viking sagas, the Europeans lost. Well, what are we to make of the Viking contribution to history then, in total, in the brief time we've had to look at this? They were the fiercest warriors of their day. They were expert navigators. They were shrewd merchants and dauntless explorers sailing off the edge of the map. Their culture, while based around the murderous activity of roving bands of pirates, enjoyed a complex pagan religion that involved the burial of individuals in ships, right, skilled crafts, including the arts of war, as well as fine arts, gold work. Right. They also boast the first discovery and settlement of the island of Iceland in human history, right, as well as first contact with Native Americans and the first founding of a European settlement in North America. Viking culture retained its ferocity, but nevertheless it did embrace Christianity, converting all of Scandinavia eventually, and its far-flung colonies. It's no small accomplishment to note that it was through the Vikings that Native Americans first saw the cross of Christ in Greenland. Right? Even if not in sustained contact or in any really known missionary activity, it's still quite cool to think about. Right? Through the conquests and settlements of England and France, Viking descendants actually came to the thrones of numerous countries. Right? Particularly, and most importantly, would be William the Conqueror, who is a descendant of a Viking warlord who settles in France. And William the Conqueror, in 1066, Battle of Hastings, conquers England. His descendants are still on the throne of England today. Right? In all, right, looking at all of Viking culture, it's left its mark on history. Not just Western history, but world history, thanks to these entrepreneuring and quite fearsome men that I would not want to meet on my beaches anytime soon. Thank you for joining me tonight. Right? Before I would go, I have a few invitations for you. What is the significance of the Lindisfarne Gospels? Excellent question. Right, these are among the finest examples of illuminated Gospels that we have produced in the monastic world. The Lindisfarne community is really top-notch in its production of these images. to answer that question. Sorry, there's a bit of a delay here, right? Excellent question, right? That monastic community was quite devoted to the illumination of Gospels, right? And this is one of the most famous. Okay, so by way of conclusion, and I'll be happy to take your questions momentarily, I have a few invitations for you. First, as you may see around the internet, today is Giving Tuesday, a counterpoint of sorts to Black Friday and Cyber Monday, where instead of spending money, we donate to our favorite organizations that are making a difference. At St. Ambrose, everything we raise supports the students that are benefiting from our Catholic classical education, but especially those whose families would not otherwise be able to afford this great education. St. Ambrose strives each year to make sure that any hardworking family who desires this education for their children can do so, supported by tuition assistance. We encourage you today to make a gift at ambroseacademy.org and join us in bringing this young generation the spiritual, educational, and personal formation that will make them leaders for our communities. Second, the deadline for our live, interactive benefit dinner is coming up on Thursday, December 3rd. That's this Thursday. I highly encourage you to join us. Registered guests will receive a party box filled with food, dessert, wine, and many surprises and games for you to have a joy-filled evening, while raising needed funds to support our tuition assistance program. All the info and our new silent auction can be found at seethejoy.givesmart.com. Lastly, if you or someone you know is interested in enrolling a child at St. Ambrose, we encourage you to contact us. St. Ambrose offers top-notch academics and extracurriculars, and we're eager to talk with you about what is possible for your child here and answer any questions. You can call 608-827-5863 or send us a message at ambroseacademy.org/contact. Thank you again for joining me tonight. It has been a pleasure to share a passion of mine with you of archaeology, and I really look forward to any questions that you have and would like to wish you a very happy Advent season, Happy New Year. May God bless you and all of your families. Thank you for your time this evening. Any questions?